Welcome everybody to this panel today called Is it too late to avoid a scar on young people? Solutions for a youth inclusive recovery. I want to introduce myself. I'm Maria Rodriguez from the European Youth Forum, and this session is organized for the YouthForesight Knowledge Facility and co-organized by the International Labour Organization and the European Youth Forum. The goal of this session today is to present the impact of the pandemic on young people and to think together on recommendations and possible solutions to ensure there is no pandemic scar on us. For that, I'm delighted to have with us today these great speakers that we will introduce further on this evening. This afternoon. And before we get started, I want to comment some technicalities. This event is live streamed in Twitter and also on Facebook, but we will have the possibility to interact with our speakers today. For that, we will be using Slido. Probably you are already familiar with this tool. For using Slido, please grab your mobile phone and scan this QR code. And otherwise, you can also go to your browser and type slido.com. There you will need to type as well this code that is 258520. You can see that in the screen. So again, you can grab your phone and scan the QR code, or you can go to the browser and type slido.com. And there you will see a screen requesting you this code that we have now on the screen. Maybe we can warm up if you have already gone to Slido and have a short poll to make sure that we all can use this tool, because we also have our questions for the panelists today through this app. So I think you could see, if you go to Slido, the poll that we have just started. So what we are asking you to reply is, what aspects of young people's life do you think have been the most affected by the pandemic? So again, maybe there is a short delay, but you can start replying if you go to slido.com. I can see so far that all the above seem relevant and interconnected for you, but some people think that jobs and unemployment could be probably quite more shocked, or education and skills, mental health and well-being. I see that most of you think that all the above are quite interconnected and have been affected during this pandemic. We will see some data about this in a while. So yeah, I think some replies are still coming. All the above seem predominantly. I'm quite surprised that there is no risk of poverty, but this is for sure covered by all the above. Okay, I don't see more replies coming. But again, for those who have just joined, you only need to scan the QR code that is on the screen, or go to your browser and type slido.com. And there type in the code that is on the screen as well, 258520. And there you could use the Slido. It is important that you scan the code already now, because throughout the session, you will be able to send your questions for our panelists, and we will have a Q&A session at the end to discuss the questions that you are proposing. So perhaps moving on, and before getting started in our session and with our speakers today, we can introduce the report that we will be discussing during this afternoon, with this video that we have prepared for that.
The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted all of us, And as the world works towards solutions, some of us are left behind. At the European Youth Forum, we focused our research on the social, economic and mental health impact of COVID-19 on young people in Europe. Our findings should be a wake-up call. More than 1 in 4 young workers reported a decrease in income, and 11.6% of young people lost their jobs or had their hours reduced to 0. Faced with grim prospects, many young people are giving up on their career dreams. 2/3 of students said they were learning less, and 10% were not receiving any courses, teaching or testing. Their education suffered due to stress, a lack of organisation by schools, or the inaccessibility of digital learning. And it goes further than that. Nearly 2/3 of young people in Europe may be affected by mental health and well-being issues. Young people are disproportionately affected, and young women and marginalised youth even more so. So, what is being done about it? At the time of this research, 1,283 policies address the social and economic impact of COVID-19 across Europe and the UK. Only 12 targeted young people. That's less than 1%. Inaction could be disastrous. With employment, education and mental health strongly interconnected, the impact of COVID-19 on young people today could damage their careers and lives decades later. We must act now. Let's build back better by investing in mental health services, quality jobs and social protection for young people. Read our findings in our report, Beyond Lockdown, the pandemic scar on young people. Let's act now.
Actually, to know quite more about this report, Beyond Lockdown, we will have today Manon De. Manon De, she is a policy officer at the European Youth Forum. She advocates there for the social and economic inclusion of young people. And previously, she was working at the European Women's Lobby as policy and advocacy officer and also at the Council of the European Union. She's passionate about youth rights and gender equality, and I very welcome you, Manon, this evening here. So, Manon, I think you will be presenting us some key findings of the report and the recommendation of the recent study of the European Youth Forum. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria, and welcome everyone. And I think I have a presentation, yes, coming up just there. So maybe you can go to the next slide already. But I'm very happy to present this report, Beyond Lockdown, the pandemic scar on young people, that we produced with the European Youth Forum and that we released a couple months ago now. This really comes from first a survey that we did with the ILO. That was a worldwide survey, really trying to look at the impact of the pandemic on young people. As we could see, it had a negative impact, but we wanted to have proper data to really support our advocacy there. And so we thought it would be really important and interesting for us to kind of narrow the focus and look at Europe, as this is the area that we work on as the European Youth Forum and the young people that we represent. So we based this report on a survey with responses from around 4,500 young people. And we also had focus groups so that we would have both qualitative and quantitative data. And our goal with this was really to first have a look at the specific impact of the pandemic on young people in Europe, really including marginalized youth. As we could see, it had an even disproportionate effect on them, and try to really look at this impact in of course, at the present, at the moment, what was the impact, but also look at the medium and long-term consequences that would have on youth and their future, because we could see, that it was not just going to be for a couple months and then everything would go away, but that it was going to have a proper impact on their future in general. And then really try and have a look at the decisions that were taken by policymakers, the actions that were put in place, and where there could be potential gaps, where the policies were really need to target youth and they didn't at the time. So that was really what we wanted to do with this report. Next slide, please. And so, what did we discover with this? What was the findings that we have? You'll see that really when looking at the impact of the pandemic, we found that it had a negative impact, of course, on mainly 3 areas that were work and income of young people, their education, and their mental health and well-being. Next slide, please. So when you look at work and income, of course, you can imagine that was something that was really impacted by the pandemic. When you look really at the concrete data, as you can see on the presentation also, almost 12% of young people stopped working, either because they completely lost their job or, they had reduced hours or even reduced to zero, so still a job, but just not working. And this is something that unfortunately impacted even more marginalized young people. As you can see, they were more than twice as likely to have stopped working. And of course, that meant that the income of young people decreased significantly. As you can see, it was the case for more than 1 in 4 young workers. So you can imagine, of course, we also tried to have discussions with those young people that were impacted. And you can imagine that losing your job, losing your income meant that they had great stress about this situation, but also of having no choice in the end, but to accept very poor working conditions, having to be in very precarious situations. So that's something that was really, really difficult for young people at the time and still is. And, just in general, it was even harder for people that were already kind of excluded from society. I think here a key point also to remember is it was already a difficult situation for young people. We came out of the 2008 crisis. We were kind of recovering, but still having many issues. And the pandemic, only highlighted the inequalities that already existed, deepened them, and added new challenges on top of the ones that were already existing. Next slide, please. So, for example, now when you look at the education, the learning experience, from the data, once again, 3/4 of students had their school closed, which of course makes sense as an answer. That's really the main answer that governments had, was just to close the facilities. But then it means also that there was a loss in quality. And, you look also once again at marginalized youth, and you realize that around 3/4 of them believe that they were learning less. And that's also what we learned from our discussions with the young people, is that not everyone has a right environment to work in. If the school closed, it means you have to be at home. Not everyone is in an environment where you have proper, a desk, proper access to digital tools. That was really a challenge also for all young people, but mostly marginalized one, of course, as we've shown before, is that, you need the digital literacy, you need the digital access. And so that made it really hard sometimes to have quality education there, and even just to access education at the time. And so once again, all those concerns about the education, the big uncertainty at the time also, and even now a little bit, even though most of the young people are now back in unis and school, but this uncertainty at the time also of will they pass their exam? What is going to happen next year? Really produced additional stress for them, and made that a very difficult situation also for students. Next slide, please. And so, that's where we really wanted to focus also on mental health and well-being. We're all aware it's an issue. We've all been aware of that, whether we work or we study. But we lacked also concrete data there to kind of support our advocacy. And so once again, we did this survey, and we found that nearly 2/3 of young people may be affected by mental health and well-being issues. And once again, young women and marginalized youth were disproportionately affected by this. I know it's quite simple to understand why so many young people were affected by mental health issues. As we showed before, when we were focusing on work and income and education, there was just a general stress and anxiety, that was related to the pandemic, the effect. Many young people were fearing, or actually had lost their independence. They had to give up on that. They had, to go back home with their parents, for example, which sometimes was actually a difficult situation for them, especially in the case of some marginalized youth. Some schools were just not understanding of the challenges that they had to face. So all of that really produced additional stress. And that's where, for example, also I want to really point at one of the key findings finally from the report, is that there is a very clear link between socioeconomic circumstances of a person, and a young person in that case, and their mental health. And so we should never separate the two, and we should always think of those issues all together when we come up with solution. Next slide, please. And so, once we've had a look at the broader picture, at really the impact, the negative impact of the pandemic on young people's lives, once we've seen what this pandemic scar could be, we wanted to look at what the governments were doing to avoid that pandemic scar to happen, or at least to stay, right? And at the time of the research, at least, which was early 2021, we found out that not a lot was, being done at the time, unfortunately. Youth was kind of overlooked, actually. When we looked especially at measures that looked at employment, economic policy measures, we found out that less than 1% of those national measures really targeted youth specifically. So they could be included as part of just the society, but not very, very few measures actually thought of youth and their specific circumstances when the policies were designed, which is really a big issue. When we looked at the responses regarding schools, mostly it was just about closing the schools without thinking of the quality of the education. So that really took a back seat. And then we just found out that there were no responses at all on supporting young people's mental health. We know that has changed a little bit since then. There have been some measures taken, still not enough, to be very honest. But that's something also that we're still working on. We are, and we will be monitoring the answers from governments since, our research, and, in the coming months and year, to see what is happening and where are still the gaps. But really, there is a gap right now, and it's, still very clear that even though we have measures that are put in place, they just don't target youth specifically as they should. Next slide, please. So, our role there was really to say, so what do? We are the European Youth Forum. We represent young people's voice across Europe, their situation. So we wanted to think all together, also with the young people through focus groups, of recommendations. Next slide, please. That we can then bring, of course, to the policymakers. So I'll go through a few of them. You can also read the report where it is even more detailed. But we had, for sure, recommendations on jobs. So, our first recommendation there was really just to prioritize the quality. It was really meaning having quality job creation. We can have incentives, for example, for employers to create those jobs, but we need to be careful that is quality jobs. So, that's funding, that would be this incentive for employers, should really be conditioned to the compliance with minimum quality standards of jobs, for example. It's about also really ensuring that all young people have access to social protection and income support. That was a big issue. That was already a big issue before the pandemic. That was even more important during. It means, there is age-based discrimination for young people's access to social protection. So we need to think of how to make sure that this doesn't happen anymore. And then it's also, we shouldn't reinvent the wheel. We have tools, we have policies that exist, like the Youth Guarantee, we have the European and the Recovery Funds now. We just need to make sure that we use them better, and that we really implement those policies, that we use them in a way that really contribute to better young people's lives, and to avoid this pandemic scar. Next slide, please. So then, of course, we had also recommendations on education. As I was saying, a lot of education had to go through digital. So it's about really making sure that there is equal access to digital tools. So, through developing accessibility standards, making sure that there's financial support for this access, that we strengthen digital literacy for young people, but also for their teachers. We shouldn't assume that all young people are completely fluent digitally. This is not the case. And so we need to work on this. And then, it's all about also providing proper career guidance for young people. that have been also going through a very uncertain time, that might be lost. It's about making sure that the people that have fallen behind because of the pandemic can get back on the way to education. And so investing in tutoring, catch-up classes, academic support. So really putting the effort there. Next slide, please. And then our last recommendations were on mental health and well-being. So once again, it's about ensuring the access to information, but also ensuring that the services are of quality. So it means, there you have to invest in the access, but you have to invest also in training for the professionals that are working with youth on how to approach these issues with young people. It's about also, as I was saying, we've all had to work digitally. We're doing live streams right now. But so it's made it harder for people sometimes to disconnect. So we need to think and to support the right to disconnect for everyone, the workers, the learners, and the educators. And then it's about what I was mentioning a bit before, really thinking holistically, having a holistic approach to mental health, and really recognize that there's a very concrete, a very real link between someone's well-being and their socioeconomic condition. Next slide, please. And so that was a quick overview of the report. I hope that was clear for everyone. I will really encourage you to go and read the report, share the report with whoever you think will be interested. And I'm really looking forward now to the discussion with the rest of the speakers to go a bit more into details on the issues that we brought up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Manon, for your insightful intervention and showing us that youth has been disproportionately affected by this pandemic, and also that we cannot look at work or education or mental health separately, but we need to see that as a whole and see the interconnections within them. Thank you a lot. And this is just the start point of our discussion now. Now the goals is thinking further and about the impact of COVID-19 with different groups, and think as well on solutions and good practices that have already taken place and that we can implement to build back better and limit the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on young people. For that, I'm delighted to welcome our three speakers this afternoon to do so. We will start with the first one, that is Cristina Sorano. Cristina, she's a YouthCan Global Project Manager at SOS Children's Villages. Cristina is leading the SOS commitment to decent jobs for youth, and she is leading as well YouthCan itself as the program that is active in 10 countries in Europe. She will share the insights on the program and which are the challenges, perhaps, which are the solutions, and also some references about the program and how it is implemented in Europe. So, Cristina, I'm quite curious. SOS Children's Villages develop an ambitious project that is this YouthCan. And you work with disadvantaged youth, preparing them for work and also supporting them on the transition from education to work. So please, can you tell us a bit more about the project and the good practices that you have already? Probably we can focus on how you have already countered this negative impact of the pandemic on young people. Great, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria. It's really a pleasure to be here with everyone on this webinar. Yes, as we know, the pandemic and the measures actually taken to mitigate it have had really a negative effect on every child, on every family, and every community. But from a social and economic perspective, as Manon was just talking about, young people have been really disproportionately impacted. And I'm sure many of us actually here might remember the challenge of finding a first job, whether it was due to lack of experience or guidance or a highly competitive market. But maybe we should all imagine how difficult this is actually for young people who cannot rely on their family for support, for resources, and very importantly, too, for networks. This is actually the reality of the young people living in alternative care or in families at risk. So actually the young people supported by SOS Children's Villages. For young people actually growing without this safety net of a stable family environment, the pandemic has actually added just another layer of pressure, actually. And it became practically another obstacle for them on their journey to become strong adults. We've seen that also in our programs at SOS Children's Villages. Some of those young people who just left our programs shortly before the pandemic had to come back looking for support, as they have, for example, lost their jobs or couldn't continue their education or even afford to pay rent. And this really speaks to what Manon was talking beforehand as a consequence, as a result of the Beyond Lockdown report presented today, when it comes to the impact the pandemic had specifically on young people in marginalized situations. At SOS Children's Villages, one concrete way we have been supporting young people in their transition to decent work is through the YouthCan initiative. It's an initiative that started globally in 2017 and is reaching today over 40 countries, out of which exactly around 10 are in Europe. In YouthCan, we actually work with diverse partners and corporate volunteers to create opportunities for trainings, mentorship, and work experience. And joining forces actually across public and private sector, we aim to support disadvantaged young people to build careers or become entrepreneurs, creating really a brighter future for themselves and their communities. Due to their involvement as well, what we have seen, a side benefit for all of us actually, is that the volunteers and as well the businesses overall get also more sensitized to the issues that young people from disadvantaged backgrounds face when they join this world of work. What we've seen with the onset of COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, our YouthCan program itself had also very much had to adapt and move online with really more urgency than we ever thought. Fortunately, by the time this happened, we had already taken some steps towards digitalization, having launched just in 2018 a digital part of the program called Youthlinks. So what we saw initially as a challenge, as we all had, we started to look at it and to figure out what could be the opportunity in it. Moving largely online, actually, what happened as a consequence was that young people continued their access to training, to mentoring, as well as personal and professional networks. Despite the crisis, we actually managed to increase the number of young people reached, around 6,500 young people in 2020. And this was really possible only due to the great commitment of the partners, but also of the corporate employees, who actually, again, volunteered their time and skills to mentor the next generation. In addition, we saw that actually through shifting to virtual activities, more young people from a wider geographical reach could be involved in YouthCan. So for the first time, it became easier for young people from locations really far from the main cities to come together and benefit from these activities. It really meant an opportunity for self-reliance for a group that needed it most, actually. So it became clear to us in YouthCan that even after the pandemic ends, we will continue to digitalize the program, as this will really break geographical barriers. But a key action for this was for us and will remain the investment in digital tools and skills in order to really bridge this digital divide. As we've also heard before from the report, the pandemic had really an effect on young people's mental health, with young people in marginalized situations feeling even more isolated, uncertain, and unhappy. When we shifted actually to mostly virtual activities back in 2020, we also noticed an unexpected side benefit. When asked actually in our annual survey, 74% of the participants in 2020 said that actually YouthCan help them cope with the pandemic and the mental health challenges attributed to it, as it actually offered a way out of isolation through training and exchange with the corporate volunteers. And in fact, the simple fact of that they could continue building their skills, getting ready for the world of work, but also building those networks, connecting with employees from different companies. All of this was in many ways a relief. From our experience in YouthCan, a challenge as big as youth unemployment, which was only now exacerbated by the pandemic, can only be tackled actually in partnerships. There is no way that a singular organization can solve it, but I think, and we think, we have a chance to do so if we work together across sectors. It needs to start with listening with the young people. They are crucial and they are the basis of all our decisions. We need to stay responsive to their needs, especially in this time of uncertainty. And together with them and with partners, we can really shape concrete interventions adapted to each local reality. So it only gives me hope to see also diverse actors joining forces to counter all this negative impact of the pandemic, especially when it comes to youth employment. And I can only hope that actually more companies, institutions, governments, as well as individuals join in. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the speakers and to a very useful conversation. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you a lot, Cristina, and thank you also and congratulations for the work you do in YouthCan, working with disadvantaged people, building their skills, and also for this approach that you just presented, that the solutions should start listening to young people. So thank you for that as well. So perhaps we can move on and present our second speaker this afternoon, that is Isabelle Fergus. She is a research manager at Plan International, and her research interest goes to gender justice and also social norms, largely through qualitative and participatory methods. Her previous research was mainly focused on gender inequalities and violence-related risks in areas affected by crisis. So I wonder, Isabelle, as Plan International has a very extensive experience working with rights, with girls' rights particularly, and we have touched this already with the insights of the Beyond the Pandemic report. But we found that this pandemic has hardly affected young women in the field of education, for example. That's also something that you have highlighted in your report, Halting Lives, the impact of COVID-19 on girls. So could you please tell us a bit more about the challenges for girls, and also which are the recommendations to improve the outcomes for girls and young women?
Yeah, thank you so much, Maria, and delighted to be here to speak today. So thank you for the opportunity. So yes, our study revealed numerous challenges that girls and young women had to face in all aspects of their daily life as a result of COVID-19. And to give you a little bit of background to that, the study was conducted with over 7,000 girls and young women aged between 15 and 24 across 14 countries in North America, Latin America, Europe, Africa, and the Asia Pacific regions between June and July 2020. And then between July 2020 and January 21, a follow-on longitudinal qualitative study was conducted with 74 girls across each of the participating countries. So this followed them as they navigated their way through the pandemic, and it just enabled us to give us a more in-depth view to the issues highlighted in our survey. So we saw from the research that 95% of girls and young women surveyed said that the pandemic had a negative effect in their lives. So while the pandemic had far-reaching effects in a number of areas for the girls and young women, similar to what Manon highlighted, the areas they felt were most challenging in both studies were around education, mental health, and family income. So on mental health, 88% of the girls and young women had experienced some levels of anxiety, ranging between high and moderate levels. They said they missed their friends, they felt they were failing to keep up with their school or college work, and they worried about their friends and family catching the virus, and they were also anxious about money and also their futures. So there was a correlation between lower levels of income and higher levels of anxiety. So girls girls and young women in upper middle income and high income countries had lower levels of anxiety than the girls and young women in lower middle and low income countries. So they worried that family members might lose their jobs, which meant there would not be money for food, education, or many of life's basic necessities. And this often kind of added to the mental health issues because it caused family tensions, which kind of just overlaid on problems they were already experiencing. So as we know, the pandemic has harmed education in all spheres. So of the girls and young women who could not physically attend their place of education, 52% of them were able to continue their education at home via online resources, such as online classes, YouTube videos. 37% were only able to continue using self-learning tools, such as books or non-digital materials, as they didn't have internet access. And then 29% used mobile apps to continue their learning. However, the quality of these varied obviously country to country, but also even within countries, the quality of some of these kind of ways of distance learning were very varied. So some of the issues cited around remote learning included access to technology, lack of space to study at home, as well as difficulties being able to concentrate and focus when learning from home. And then loneliness and domestic responsibilities also interfered with girls and young women's ability to cope with distance learning. So as Gabby, 17 from Ecuador, said, in one of our interviews, even now in Ecuador, there is a macho society where girls, no matter how young they are, have to do housework and are forced to do these things and put their education aside. They say you already lost a school year, so it's better that you do things around the house, help out, and so they no longer study. So what we cannot do is we cannot let girls fall further behind and undo the last 2 decades of progress on girls' education. So I do want to highlight some ways to improve outcomes for girls. So as we saw, COVID-19 disrupted traditional education delivery channels. So we do need an approach which ensures inclusive and accessible methods of remote learning that also considers the gender digital divide. And we also need inclusive and accessible psychosocial support and stress prevention to help girls and young women cope when there are major disruptions such as COVID-19 or climate change disasters. So evidence has shown that low tech and no tech solutions are best at reaching the most vulnerable and support continuity of learning during crisis and disruptions. A combination of television and radio programming and the distribution of print materials has been used in low income contexts as a more accessible and inclusive strategy to reach learners. However, at the same time, we do need to look beyond traditional thinking and explore technological innovations that can be delivered at scale, but also at a low cost. But these efforts must be approached with long-term perspectives that prioritizes equitable access, community mobilization, and engagement that ensures that no girl is left behind. So at Plan International, we have developed both policy and programmatic expertise on gender transformative education, which seeks to redress some of these structural inequalities that prevent equal opportunity within education systems. And most importantly, we need to see girls and young women shaping education systems and directly represented in decision-making spaces. So obviously, no one knows girls better than they do themselves, and this means shifting the power to young people by listening and treating them as leaders and decision makers in their own right. I'm going to stop there so I don't go over, but our both reports, Halting Lives 1 and Halting Lives 2, are available on the Plan International website if you would like to learn more. And again, many thanks for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you a lot, Isabelle, for also recalling us that we need to have this gender approach at looking at the impacts of the COVID-19, but also when thinking about the recovery and the solution. So thank you a lot for this. With our next speaker, we will go with another layer of pressure in this crisis. Our next speaker is Rita Gupta. She's an educator and social entrepreneur. She's the co-founder of Labia Foundation, a globally recognized Indian nonprofit that enables 2.5 million children from low socioeconomic backgrounds to cope the effects of poverty and also to become lifelong learners. During her journey, she worked with education nonprofits like Teach for India and Teach for All. And she also currently serves as board member at the advisory board of Generation Unlimited India. So, Rita, as young leader who's done an amazing job leading the fight against the crisis with your community, we would like to hear a bit more on the actions that you have implemented at the community level, and also particularly regarding the mental health and the well-being of young people. So, yeah, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Maria. And thank you to Cristina and Isabelle for sharing your thoughts and all the wonderful work that you've been doing all across the world. Maria, to your question, of course, mental health and well-being, as we've all iterated time and time again, even in this discussion, the need of it has amplified multifold during the pandemic, and now, thankfully, we have some data from some countries around this. In India specifically, and in the South Asian region, definitely the mental health crisis has been amplified much more than other countries and other regions across the world. In fact, recently in a UNICEF survey of about 21 countries, only 41% young people in India said that it was okay to ask for help when it comes to mental health problems. And that is extremely worrying because India harbors most young people in the world. We have more than 300 million young people currently in the country who are looking to build their futures and build the country back together as we go into the recovery process. Which brings us to this question of, whether simply supporting or looking at mental health and well-being from a support perspective is good enough, or is there something more than we can do? Which is where my work and the work of Generation Unlimited India comes in the being, because we looked at mental health and well-being from a skills perspective as well. So not only did we provide spaces to young people during the pandemic and now in the recovery process to access support when it comes to mental health, but also build the essential skills required to maintain mental health, to build resilience, to build stronger relationship skills, and to feel the motivation to learn even after learning has been compromised significantly during the COVID-19 pandemic. So from a Generation Unlimited India perspective, we launched a huge pan-India program called Young Warrior during COVID, especially during the second wave around May 2021. Wherein we prioritized spreading information through young people, for young people, to young people, around COVID-appropriate behavior, around safe spaces, how to preserve your mental health, how to take care of other people who are unwell, and what more we can do in our communities. This was a multi-stakeholder, multi-platform campaign which ran from low-tech platforms to in-person events to awareness, etc. And through this we reached about 6.6 million people, wherein 6.6 million actions were taken by young people to protect their communities against COVID-19, which was immense. And a lot of the ownership of the program design to the implementation was actually spearheaded by young people, especially the Young People's Action Team or the youth board that I happen to serve on at Generation Unlimited India. So that is the amount of work that was happening by young people. And it really goes to show that we really have the pieces in place. We just need to mobilize young people. We just need to have the right platforms to be able to understand our needs, our community's needs, especially the needs of young people from marginalized communities and constituencies, persons with disabilities, all sorts of communities, and see what we can do for each other using each other's collective experience and expertise. So that was on the Generation Unlimited India front. On the nonprofit front, so thank you, Maria, for sharing that. I run an India-based nonprofit called Labhya, and essentially what we do is we partner with governments and multilaterals to make social emotional well-being accessible to children and young people across India at scale. And we hold the government accountable to run a daily mandatory well-being class within the school systems every year across all government schools or public schools of the state, which helps us institutionalize the need for mental health and well-being, not just from a support perspective, but as a skill building perspective and a necessary mandatory perspective in the school systems, especially public education systems that cater to the most underserved children across India. And so through these programs over the past 4 years, we've been working with about 2.4 million children. But of course, during the pandemic, similar to what was shared earlier, our children were out of school. They did not have access to any kind of internet or devices even. And so we had to rethink what we thought social emotional well-being would look like and how we would look at access once again, really from the scratch. In that case, what we did was we looked at low bandwidth methods. We collaborated with governments, multilaterals, nonprofits who were working directly with children, and deployed and reinvented our entire program through SMSs, through interactive voice response, so automated calls that were going to young people's and children's parents' phones, with activities and small things that they could do on a day-to-day basis with their families, knowing the constraints of COVID, knowing the stress that they were going through, knowing that their parents were also going through some kind of stress because of unemployment and other economic impacts that had happened because of COVID. And they could do these small activities with their parents and siblings and peers in order to maintain their resilience, in order to build those skills to go through and come through stronger through the pandemic. So we did all kinds of things, whether it was using community radio, slots in TVs, in news channels. We also looked at automated voice calling systems, and also through WhatsApp and other mediums which were used commonly through the different communities of children that we were working with. Teachers played a tremendous role in this entire ecosystem. Although we work with a lot of governments and multilaterals, but teachers were the access to the last mile. Teachers tracking children, calling children, making sure that they were attending online classes or at least getting access to any of these low bandwidth solutions that we had provided, and really ensuring that every child is coming along and no child is left behind in the mass migration that happened in a lot of the digitally dark areas as well. And so a big part of our work was also teacher well-being and educator well-being, where we enabled teacher spaces where they could thrive, they could really think about what their well-being looks like in the current scenario and how they can provide better support to themselves and to the children that they were working with, while they pivoted from a completely offline teaching structure, school, a physical environment, to something that was online, that was difficult to track, and in an environment where they did not know what success actually looked like for themselves as educators. So this is basically how we went about tackling the mental health crisis that is now ongoing, but started and amplified during the COVID-19 pandemic. Going forward, we are partnering again with UNICEF and Generation Unlimited India to come up with a pilot which will sustain social, emotional, and life skills through low bandwidth areas through WhatsApp and asynchronous learning. This project is called YW Next, and it is supported by multiple organizations, including UNICEF, which will be piloted and hopefully be scaled up pan-India post the pandemic as well, to ensure that mental health is not a good to have in schools, especially, and especially for young people, but is a must have and is institutionally integrated in the systems that young people interact in and exist in. I think lastly, before I go over time, I know we also have a lot of interesting questions coming in. The most important key link of any of the work that we've done in a country like India, which is so complex, which has such a huge population of young people, is keeping young people at the center. Myself, my team at Club here, all of us, our team at the Young People's Action Team in Generation Unlimited India, all young people really could come to the forefront, could communicate, had spaces to communicate our needs, and really co-create something that was meaningful for young people at scale. And I think going forward, if we're going to create something which is youth inclusive, that is going to help us overcome all the challenges that we have just talked about for young people across the world, young people have to be in the center and at the forefront of this change.
Thank you a lot, Rita, for these inspiring last words as well. And I'm honestly impressed by the reach of your work and for how innovative you were reinventing the solutions with the tools and with the constraints that you have. So congratulations on that. I'm now inviting all the speakers to come to this virtual stage, and probably we can. I don't know if you have any first reaction to the interventions that we already had, but before that, I want to recall our audience that we are using the Slido for questions, so you can scan this QR code that we have here on the screen and send your questions for the speakers. So, any reaction? Do you want to say something at this point, both Isabel, Cristina, or Rita?
Sure, I can say something. Yeah, just listening to Rita there, I think it's quite shocking, maybe also not surprising, just how many young people were not feeling comfortable talking about or asking for help around mental health. And I think it's really a thing that we've seen in our research kind of coming up more and more, mental health issues, but definitely it's kind of been only coming up in the last 4 or 5 years. Maybe it's obviously the pandemic, but also linked to, increased access to technology. So I really loved hearing a lot about your interventions and kind of innovative ways that you're kind of tackling the issue in India, because it is such a cross-cutting issue and affects so many areas. And I think we kind of need to further expand our research and programmatic efforts to really kind of make it more of a frontline area going forward. So yeah, those are just my thoughts.
I also really have to comment. I really appreciated that without even talking before about this, but really we all mentioned and we all brought up this importance of really young people, girls, women, really being involved in all from the very first point of coming up with the solution till the implementation and spearheading the actions. I really think that's something that we saw also today, but I think we cannot talk enough about how important it is that the people themselves are part of the solutions and they are part of the shaping, making the decisions and shaping the solutions that they will be getting, so to say, at the end of it. And we've seen that also in YouthCan, in our program at SOS Children's Villages. We've put that also at the core of what we do. So really young people themselves are the first ones who raise their needs. They are the ones who say what kind of skills they need to develop in order to make the step towards employment. And then we come in with partners, bringing in the perspective of the employer perspective, so to say. But it really starts with the young people, because we should never underestimate how much young people themselves know what they need in order to succeed. So I really appreciated that we all talked about that and we raised that as a very important topic.
Indeed, I'm super happy also to have heard that from you three. And we have our first question from the audience today. So great to have also Manon with us to reply to this first question, that is, if you had to choose only one policy measure that the governments could implement for this recovery, which one would it be? It's a tough one, I know, but yeah, maybe you have already something. Who of you would like to start? Manon? Okay, go ahead.
I'm happy to start. Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you to the other speakers. It was super interesting. Thank you so much. I mean, yeah, it is a difficult question. I think one thing would be, it's not exactly a measure, but would be something I said during the presentation, is really having this holistic approach. Never forget to look at the big picture and not just look, at a very small thing, and also think long term and the impact it will have on the future. In terms of measure itself, I would say one thing that is very important for young people would be to guarantee their access to social protection and minimum income, that there's no discrimination for them to access it, so they can actually survive during a period like a pandemic and just in general. So if I had to choose, but once again, it is difficult, and that would be this.
I think I can go next. I think plus one to everything that Mano shared. I think I do not disagree with that one bit. I think adding to that, one thing that I think is extremely important, as whether as a policy or as a norm, that we need to start looking at very seriously is the partnership of young people with institutions and systems. Whether it's through systems change, a lot of us talked about all the studies we did and the impact we're having and the work we're doing, and it's all about partnerships with governments and multilaterals and how all of that intersects together. And so we really need to mandate some of that and make sure that amongst all of that, young people's voice needs to be heard. And I think secondly, the second most important thing is getting students back to the learning institutions that they were dropped off of last year, so that we can really start building back better by bringing everyone together to an institution where the rebuilding will really have to begin.
I can continue very quickly. I am, of course, a bit biased, so I will go for policy towards youth employment specifically. And I do think that the job creation, specifically targeting youth and really encouraging generally business to create more quality jobs, of course, for youth, I think that would be my, so to say, preferred one from all the very important other policies recommendations.
Yeah, I can go next. I mean, obviously, yeah, lots of important ones have already been said, but yeah, I think for me, it will be kind of looking at linking kind of mental health support services with education kind of systems and institutions going forward. And I think, you know, there's been a lot of disruptions or emergencies in countries previously to pandemic, like disasters or wars and stuff. And I think that a lot of this has already become to the fore before, but COVID has really amplified these discussions, which is good to see.
Great, thank you a lot. We also have another question. It's quite linked to what Cristina already commented. And it's, what role do you think employers and employers' organizations can play in supporting young people and protecting their rights? So I don't know if you, any of you would like to reply to this question about the role of employers. Cristina, do you want to start?
I can start, and I'm definitely not covering all the answer. As I mentioned, yes, we have really the experience of employers themselves being directly involved in the process of shaping the next generation, so to say. So I do think that actually they can have a crucial role in terms of really bridging between their own employees, the current employees, and in many cases what can be the future employees. They also have a role, I believe, especially we have had this experience in YouthCan, of really making sure that their own employees and they as businesses understand the different challenges that different young people might have from, for example, marginalized backgrounds is one example, but there can really be so many different situations. And I believe really having direct contact with the different young people and the different groups of young people out there, there is really also a better sensitization to the issues and how to adapt the workplace, but also how to make their own current employees more open to working with really diverse backgrounds. So definitely a huge role that employers can have.
Manon, I think you also wanted to reply before.
Yeah, I mean, really to support what Cristina said, I think, you know, the dialogue there is extremely important and can really bring about very positive change. And, you know, I think it's really also on the employers, it's also their duty to just ensure that there are good quality for work, good quality conditions. Sorry, I'm losing my English to that point. So I think, you know, as Cristina was saying, they have a huge role and they can do a lot of good things there. But once again, you know, I think this dialogue and this work together hand in hand, I think is really important.
We have another question directly to Isabelle on one thing she commented, and is on the question of being unwilling to ask for help where there are were there any significant differences in relation to gender differences in terms of asking for help?
So our study was actually only conducted with girls and young women, so we didn't actually look at gender differences. So unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that. But I know, Rita, you said that you did some work along this, so you might have the answer.
Thanks, Isabelle. Yes, so we did work with, of course, all kinds of young people across during COVID. And there was definitely a difference between, I don't know about asking for help, but generally who was on the radar and who was able to actually engage more. So we saw that there was a lot of engagement for young women who had access to devices for more amount of time, who had more agency to use their time in their households versus those who were sharing devices, who were late adopters of technology, or who were depending on devices that were owned by their parents because of the gatekeeping that happens for technology, especially in rural parts of the country. So there was definitely a difference in engagement, but the willingness we saw of completing once the young people had access was definitely something to commend, especially for young girls and young women.
Thank you a lot for this discussion. I think here we are wrapping up our panel today. I just want to recall some of the things that you commented throughout the panel. The first one could be that we cannot look at work, education, and well-being separately. We need to see the whole picture and the interconnections between all of them. We need to put particular attention on the different layers of pressure that we face, young people. We are not an homogeneous group. We need to see how the impact is particularly on marginalized groups and how we can build the solutions for marginalized group that has been the heaviest impact by this crisis. And also we need to take into account, and policymakers should make sure that young people are in the front of this recovery, that they engage with young people, and that young people are properly listened in building the solutions for this crisis. Thank you a lot for this conversation. Thank you all our audience, both in Twitter, in Facebook, for being with us today. And you can follow our activity on social media. Thank you a lot for this event.